Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie, and my dear friend Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional, who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, uh, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, and partly raised in Australia, lived and worked in London and Paris, and 15 years ago, by a quirk of fate, relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, and predominantly love of art as life goes on. And without further ado, over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town and studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense, and have been more making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg, where I had Hazard Gallery, and that was the context that I met Valerie about 10, 12 years ago, and just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. And that conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation, and look forward to where this goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it usually goes anywhere and everywhere, but somehow we always come back to art, and
Yeah,
because it is the love that loves us back. Thank you very
right.
much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the journey. Hi, Jonathan. Yeah,
Hi, Valerie.
and so we're talking as Freeze London has entered into its first post-global art recession session, as which will be followed by Art Basel. And one of the things that has been a conversation for in my internal monologue. By the way, I read somewhere recently that only 60% of the world population have or have no internal monologue whatsoever, which I find hard to believe, because yeah, what do they do the rest of the time? And also, some of us have
I'll
more
keep that.
dialogue. I have full on sort of parliamentary debates, but one of the things that has been revolving in my head, partly in the view of the way art is publicized and sold right now, is kind of the idea of the cult of the artist. And people would say, well, the cult of the artist is something that we've dealt with, we've had for a long time, starting from the Renaissance and the idea of, genius. But I think in my view, it's become way more, like, I think it's a way more of a contemporary phenomenon. At least the current iteration, I find in some ways more damaging, because because of the not necessarily because of the cult of the artist as the artist, but the artist being expected to be an authority in fields that they're not an authority of. And that sort of deification of the artist that I notice happening, where not only are artists expected to be public figures, they're also expected to be public intellectuals. And it does a disservice to them as people. It does a disservice to society. We're often saying, oh, artists should be involved in politics, artists should be contributing to science, and we both have art practices. You're a practicing artist. You can comment very authoritatively on whether or not artists should be involved in science or politics.
I mean, I know I'm with you. I think on the first point of the kind of deification of artists, it's really a selling tool mostly. It's like, let's let's weave a spell around this artist so that they a kind of backstory. Often the backstory involves kind of exaggerating personal strife and so on, or creating a bumpier road to the place they're at now, so that it feels like the work has more depth and meaning. And it's dangerous for an artist because they believe the narrative rather than admit to, and I think most artists would corroborate this, admit to the fact that they don't really know where it comes from. They don't, certainly the best work happens in a kind of flow state where if it's really good, you're mostly not there. You know, you're mostly a channel, you know, or you're mostly consumed by the process of making it, so that it's only after you've made it that you can even stand back and digest it. And if you overload the kind of ego story or the kind of the scaffolding of narrative around that, it appears as if the artist thinks they know what they've done. And the beauty of it and the most exciting function of art, in my opinion, is that it operates like a tool or a voice which is outside of all of that. And it gives us these marvelous, unexpected illuminations into something that the artist himself doesn't, or herself doesn't know much about. And I guess that's where it's opposite to science or whatever, you know, that it
Let
is
alone politics, science, or social policy. Like forget being a contributor to current ideological debates. Like if you don't know what your own work is all about, and that has to be okay, because it's a different form of intelligence, it's a different form of processing, and it's yeah, and I think that is, and like I have to agree, it's like it's trying to utilize art to make, and I rail against art always being made into a tool of social policy, because what you're then saying is that art in and of itself is not enough. It doesn't have a purpose outside itself. If you try to corrupt it by giving it a purpose, one of the, and I think it's, two things is like expert fallacy, and we live in a world that is rife with expert fallacy. Expert fallacy being assuming that someone who's an expert in one field can be an expert in another, asking doctors for political views, asking filmmakers or actors are the biggest one. I played a doctor, I played a doctor on Grey's Anatomy, and of course I'm qualified to discuss social problems in in Southern Africa. Like, why wouldn't I? It's it's the same. I think Bono fell into that trap with some of his projects, welfare projects, because and also that project, as we all know, like Bob Gelder's project is like has created this entire sort of white savior industry, which has been incredibly damaging, so, and that is like an example of this kind of expert fallacy. But I also I want to say that since you're in the UK, I think some of this, I would trace the origins of this as to the building like a celebrity culture of artists that began kind of in the 80s and 90s, right? But I would say more in the 90s with YBAs, when artists really began to have visible personalities, like you had to, because they were in the social pages. I would assume that Basquiat is also part of that kind of celebrity culture. Before that time, again, like artists were not expected to have social or visible personalities or have opinions about things, and they could, and they had, and their works would have the space to develop in the absence of the, of a superimposed opinion. And I think it's, I think, I hopefully think that this too shall pass, but I think it's really has become a form of oppression on.
It's challenging because if you look at artists, I've been watching a really good kind of dramatization on Mozart, and it sits nicely alongside that brilliant film Amadeus, which is one of the best films about an artist ever made. but it tackles the struggle, essentially the struggle that he had just to be able to practice his art, the struggles which are the same forever. How do I support my family and pay the rent? How do I get to make the art that I want to make in a kind of structure of patronage that doesn't want what I want to make? Father that disapproved of him. I'm lucky that I don't have that, but it's pretty commonplace. Family's not exactly getting behind your concept. And then war, like the Habsburgs suddenly go to war with the Ottoman Empire, just as he's hitting his golden moment. He's written the Magic Flute, and then the party's over and everyone's at war, and somehow he does make he dies too young, of course, and etc. But he does make these great works. But with this super ego artist, the kind of cloud that surrounds this massive self-supporting noise is almost impenetrable. And so in some ways the struggle is no longer there, and then there's no kind of real issue, no real oxygen around it. It's just fed by its own kind of rhetoric. And I don't think that's good for great art. I think that's a kind of problem. And then, another thing I read recently was about the moment the Mona Lisa became a celebrity, when it was taken from Paris and it did this tour to New York. It was the first time that left Europe. And it was this moment when an artwork became a kind of celebrity object. And seeing it at the Louvre recently, you've seen it in its current state. It's like you can't actually see it. It's a phenomenon of this mass of people, and this phenomenon of this idea of when an artwork or the kind of noise around it becomes more important than the physical experience of being in front of the work. Something's definitely lost. You're looking at a name, not a work. And I'm not sure what exactly that is, but there's something of the ego being in front of the work, which doesn't belong to the artist. It just happens to come through them.
And I think it's also partly because we've built an infrastructure where, we've, which is almost entirely market driven, where it's in the best interest of the gallerist to deify the artist, and there's a lot of pandering that goes on to, and I think, I've shared several reels with you where just, there's a gallerist or someone's in conversation with a famous artist, and the artist is not saying anything even remotely profound or special, but everyone is just saying, yes, this is incredible. Oh, and like everything that artist says, like, and they're talking about whatever it is, like their domestic, I make a cup of tea or something, before going into the studio. And to me, the process of making tea and sometimes adding some sugar is somewhat special. And that's great news. That's really great news. But is this worth, is this something that we should be focused in, especially since elaborating their own art is often a process of ex post facto rationalization for the artists themselves, and most artists I know is just as open to third parties discovering something in the work that they themselves were not aware of, because that's, so again, art is not an object, as said, but in fact an opportunity, like more like a catalyst, right? I think
I'll throw a curveball into that, because over the last 10 years or so, maybe because my practice involves going up mountains and doing things that are kind of photographically interesting, photographers and videographers have constantly popped up in my life asking to document that, can I join you on a mission up a mountain or whatever? And so I've had this quite well documented time, and I find, as just from my own practice, looking at myself making a work, looking at the things that I'm doing which seem sort of habitual or seem ordinary, observing them, I find that helpful to me as an artist to kind of understand it. I don't know if it's that interesting to share it, but it's definitely has some function. But it's when it gets funneled into a PDF to sell a story, then it feels a bit odd. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like when you sometimes talk to collectors who insist on, it's the importance of meeting the artist, and I'm
Mm.
like, it feels in some ways almost carnivorous, right? It's like you want to eat more than there already is, or a little bit vampirical, right? And also, I mean, it's like on their side, but also not entirely helpful. Not like,
Mm.
you will not actually learn more because the process of learning is between you and the artwork. And just what if you are to learn that the artist is, like with a really
Mm.
problematic approach to life and everything, but the work is stunning. Like, what is, and I mean, I guess we're addressing death of the author in that sense, is like, is his work not valid? Is his
Yeah.
work lacking in merit because you disapprove of his lifestyle? It's like extra knowledge, like sometimes more is less. Like I think you're not often more is less. It's
Yeah, also that sensationalizing the kind of the 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 kind of artist who's a mess being the kind of artist that makes is a genius. The kind of Francis Bacon model. His studios is a mess and the work is brilliant, etc. Or Van Gogh, he was tortured, he never sold a painting, but he was a genius. And I kind of contest that slightly. I do think that um, you take someone like Agnes Martin, who was clearly very at one with herself, very happy, and the work is the work. It's not because she was at one with herself or happy. She was just lucky. She just happened to be someone who found a kind of place in the world that wasn't torture. And Van Gogh didn't have that experience, and he was unlucky. But the work is neither better nor worse. The work is despite that. It's a kind of Mozart dying at 35 because he overworked himself. It's a great shame. But that's not why he wrote the Requiem. He wrote the Requiem because he got commissioned to, and then he died sadly at the end of it.
We can talk about Salieri on another. It's
Yes.
that whole thing is like that is, the whole Salieri thing is a whole other conversation. But
Mhm.
yeah, look, I agree with you entirely that it is disingenuous. And now I've lost my train of thought about uh suffering artists.
Yeah.
It's not so much. I do agree that it's not the suffering that makes you, but I think uh just being, like I remember, I mean, I think the best example of the problematics of identity politics driving contemporary artists. I was talking to a young person who, like, in Basel, and she's they're an artist, and I think they're trans, and then everyone was demanding of them where in their work were the trans issues, and they were not there because the work was not about that. This was not an interest, and
Yeah.
the constant demand to uh, be forced to insert yourself into your work, from a perspective of whatever is ideological perspective that is the zeitgeist, is really oppressive, and it's offensive, and was offensive to the artist, and I think legitimately so. That this kind of, it's censorious demand that you meet ideology where it is at rather than where you are. And I think we also talk about Hifikepunye Mokwena's issues, where he's an abstractionist, but
Mm.
very politically conscious abstractionist, and how he expresses the world and his freedom to express is a very South African and very conversational approach. He is in conversation with his city, and he finds it extremely difficult to subsist as an abstractionist in today's Johannesburg because of the social or peer group pressure
Mm.
be figurative, because that is
Mm.
considered to be a legitimate form of political expression. Now, for me, as someone who was born in the former Soviet Union, I'm very conscious of what, and especially in the art community of the former Soviet Union, very, very conscious of what social realism was and the demands of complying with politically and ideological mandates and how they operate. And I find very similar oppression in contemporary art world, which is ridiculous because it's the opposite of freedom, and art is a form of freedom, right? And I mean,
100%. If you start to, it's a little bit, this is a big subject, but the area of kind of public funding and competitions and so on, when there's a parameter set, we're looking for works with these boxes ticked, is a kind of micro of the macro art world, which is saying, these are the buzzwords. This is what we're interested in. This is what's selling. So either make work like that or be irrelevant. And I'm not complaining. I mean, it's a very narrow way to operate, but does create a lack of freedom. And so it's up to the artist to work through that. They have to make their own
well,
way.
the two ways. I mean, if there's a fully fleshed out art infrastructure where the grant sort of component is a very limited one, they don't have an opportunity to be oppressive, like ideologically oppressive. But when they're a majority of the funding, which they are in some environments, then that's where real oppression kicks in. And people will, of course, will feel free to want to cancel us and say that everything that we're saying is incredibly bourgeois. But or it would be if we were in fact people who had trust funds. So this is the point at which we declare
Yeah,
to the
I mean, you
powers,
don't.
the powers of zeitgeist, that neither one of us is sitting on a trust fund, and every both of us have had to scrape and build
Oh.
ourselves from essentially
Yeah.
the ground up. I will hold my hand up to say that my parents left the Soviet Union with 3 suitcases and $200 and
Hmm.
no real prospects other than education, and had to build everything from scratch, including forcing me into an ambiguous career as a lawyer. But I think it's also the fact that we have to feel like we have to defend ourselves or defend our
Yeah.
opinion, that or we're not that we're privileged somehow to demand freedom of speech. And I think that's entirely problematic. To quote Steve Biko's, I write what I like. And what does that mean? What does it mean to a painter? What does it mean to a sculptor? What does it mean to a writer?
It's a huge point. I had such a perfect example of it last week where I'd been commissioned to do a painting related to a place. That essentially come to this amazing place and respond to it. And in the process of them showing me the place, they were also telling me which bits of the place they liked most, And I fell into that trap of accommodating their vision into my own. And luckily, the painting was such a monumental disaster that I was forced to go back to what I know, which is paint what you like, do what you want and do it for you, without any kind of external. And that sounds egotistical, or it sounds kind of selfish, but really it's the only way that that portal, which the channel through which the work happens without you, essentially you've got to get out of the way, you've got to make the room only filled with your own joy of being there. And yeah, then it's worked again.
No, it's
But
called
you
take the
can't
money
explain
and
that to someone who.
it's take the money and run. I call it the take the money and run approach. I mean, sure, get because that was the other way. I talk to artists where I say yeah, sure, a lot of these conditions might seem oppressive. Just just get the money and run. Do whatever write whatever you need to write, but just for God's sake, don't do what they say they ask you to do, because if they wanted to, if they were, if they were the artist, they would be the artist, but they're not the artist, so they can't be the artist. And you're doing them a favor.
Mm.
So yeah. on
There
that.
was there was a whole furor around that about a Swedish artist who was given 70,000 pounds to make an artwork, and he made an artwork called "Take the Money and Run,"
Yeah,
which is that he didn't give them an artwork.
perfect. I think they
Right.
deserve everything they get. To be honest, if that's, I think that's a very valid statement. It's performative. It's
Hmm.
it's conceptual. It's art.
Yeah.